You're nothing but an animal. CEO tortured veteran janitor, unaware he's the real boss. The Friday afternoon sun slanted through the glass crown of Sterling Tower, painting streaks of gold across marble floors that gleamed like liquid fire. 55 stories above Manhattan, the city's wealthiest youth gathered to toast themselves in a penthouse of white stone, crystal light, and Dom Perignon that flowed without pause. At the center of it all stood Marcus Sterling, heir by name and CEO by title, a man who had never carried weight heavier than his Patek Philippe, but who wore arrogance as though it were armor. His friends, bankers' sons, politicians' heirs, trust fund creatures of privilege, laughed loudly at jokes that never cost them anything. Then Marcus's eyes, restless with the cruelty of boredom, caught on a figure in the hall. A tall man stooped by years, pushing a cart stacked with rags and polish. The janitor's navy uniform bore a cracked name tag, Frank, maintenance staff. His hair was clipped short and white, his face carved with the kind of lines that spoke not of age alone, but of endurance. He worked quietly, his broad hands steady, his movements precise. Most passed him as though he were furniture. Marcus saw an opportunity. "Gentlemen," Marcus drawled, swirling champagne in his flute, "how about a little entertainment? Watch how easily the powerful command the weak." He strode to the glass door and flung it open. His voice cracked across the hall. "Hey, old man, get in here." Frank straightened, cloth in hand, eyes pale and alert. "Sir, I'm just finishing the corridor." "I didn't ask what you were doing," Marcus snapped, his grin sharp. "I told you to get in here." The friends leaned forward, hungry for spectacle. Frank hesitated, then pushed his cart aside and stepped through the threshold into the gleaming penthouse, the door hissing shut behind him. He looked out of place in that palace of wealth, a man of work among boys of play. They smelled blood, though none of them realized the hunt was about to turn. Sterling Tower loomed above Manhattan like a blade of glass thrust into the sky. Its mirrored skin captured the restless pulse of the city, the yellow streams of taxis, the spires of rival towers, the endless churn of life below. Inside, however, the world was engineered to feel untouchable. Air hummed with a filtered chill, marble and steel gleamed without blemish, and wealth pressed against every surface until even silence seemed expensive. For those who worked there, Sterling Tower was not just an office, but a fortress of power, a place where ambition either thrived or withered under scrutiny. Frank Morrison walked its halls each day unseen. 62 years old, his body carried the quiet strength of a man who had weathered too many storms to count. Though his back had bent slightly with time, his frame was still solid, his shoulders broad enough to hint at a different past. His hair was close-cropped and white, his skin darkened by years beneath harsh suns, and his blue eyes were sharp in a way that unsettled those who looked too long. Yet his uniform, a simple navy set issued to maintenance staff, rendered him invisible. Most people saw only the cracked plastic name tag pinned to his chest. Frank, maintenance staff. He arrived at 5 each morning, when the city's shadows still stretched long and the tower's lights were beginning to blink awake. He polished brass handles until they gleamed, swept marble halls until they whispered beneath expensive shoes, and left late in the evening after the last meetings had emptied into the night. People nodded to him in passing, a perfunctory courtesy, but few learned his voice. To them he was background, a necessary fixture like the humming elevators or the scent of disinfectant in the stairwells. That was precisely how he wanted it, because Frank Morrison was not what he appeared. Behind the quiet uniform lived a man who had once carried a colonel's stars in the Delta Force. 28 years of service had etched discipline into his bones, and when he left the military, he had carried that same discipline into business. With measured risks and ruthless focus, he built Morrison Holdings into an empire that spanned blocks of Manhattan, acres of California coast, and towers in cities around the world. Sterling Tower itself had been his acquisition, absorbed into his holdings after a complex merger. On paper, Marcus Sterling was CEO, the youthful figurehead meant to attract investors. In truth, the deed to the tower bore only one name: Franklin Morrison. To Frank, disguising himself as a janitor was not humiliation, but reconnaissance. He had learned long ago that a man's true character emerged not when he spoke to equals, but when he believed he was unobserved or superior. Reports of Marcus's arrogance had reached him, stories of employees reduced to tears, assistants humiliated for sport, even security guards dismissed for imagined slights. Frank needed no boardroom briefing. He wanted to see for himself how the young Sterling treated those he believed beneath him. Marcus Sterling had never been beneath anyone in his life. At 29, tall, athletic, with a mane of dark hair cut by stylists and a wardrobe sewn by Armani, he looked the part of success before he had earned a shred of it. The only son of an Upper East Side dynasty, he had been educated at Wharton, polished by summers in Europe, and cushioned by a trust fund large enough to insulate him from reality. When Morrison Holdings installed him as CEO of Sterling Enterprises 8 months earlier, he inherited not only an office, but a kingdom built by someone else's hands. Marcus embraced the role with relish. He arrived each morning in a Lamborghini whose engine roared through the canyons of glass like a declaration. He wore Patek Philippe watches, ordered champagne lunches, and surrounded himself with a coterie of wealthy companions who treated the penthouse like their personal playground. To employees, he was less a leader than a storm to be endured, volatile, arrogant, and convinced that cruelty equaled control. He relished moments of dominance, especially over those least able to resist. To him, power was not responsibility, but entertainment. On that Friday afternoon, Marcus had gathered 6 of his closest friends in the penthouse suite of Sterling Tower. The room itself was an opulent stage, white marble floors polished to a blinding sheen, walls of glass opening onto the Manhattan skyline, chandeliers dripping light like melted ice. Bottles of Dom Perignon chilled in silver buckets, crystal flutes gleamed, and laughter clanged against the glass like brass cymbals. These men had been born into privilege and had never questioned it. They traded stories of deals closed, parties crashed, fortunes made without effort, each tale more indulgent than the last. When Marcus spotted Frank outside in the corridor, bent over his work cart, a grin spread across his face. The janitor was an opportunity, a chance to remind his friends of his supposed dominance, to prove again that he could bend the world beneath him. "Gentlemen," he announced, champagne glass raised, "how about a show? Watch how easily a man learns his place when reminded of it." His companions laughed, eager for cruelty dressed as sport. And so Frank was summoned, the old soldier stepping through the penthouse doors as the predators closed in, unaware that the prey they mocked carried more authority than any of them could imagine. The penthouse air smelled of champagne and arrogance. Marcus leaned against a marble counter, his Rolex glinting beneath the chandelier as he fixed Frank with a predator's grin. Around him, his companions sprawled in leather chairs, and along the glass wall that overlooked Manhattan, their laughter already bubbling in anticipation. "Well, look at this," Marcus said loudly, gesturing with his glass. "A living exhibit from the Museum of Uselessness." He tipped his flute, letting golden liquid splash across the pristine floor. The fizz hissed against stone, a deliberate scar on perfection. "Clean it up." Frank stepped forward, unhurried, his eyes calm though the insult landed heavy in the room. He set down his cart, knelt, and blotted the spill with a folded cloth. His motions were steady, precise, devoid of humiliation. But Marcus saw only an audience and a stage. "Pathetic, isn't it?" Marcus said to his friends. "He's probably been mopping floors his whole life, dreaming of nothing more." He emptied the rest of his glass onto the floor, then tossed the flute itself so it clattered and rolled. "Faster, old man, don't make me wait." Laughter rippled across the room. Jason Whitmore, a senator's son with slicked hair and restless eyes, leaned forward. "Does he ever talk back?" he asked, his tone mocking curiosity. "Or has he already forgotten what it's like to be treated like a person?" Marcus's grin sharpened. "Talk back? This one doesn't dare. Look at him. He's grateful I even acknowledge he exists." He reached for another bottle, uncorked it with a theatrical pop, and poured deliberately onto the marble again. The puddle spread toward Frank's knees. "There, another test. Let's see how quickly the janitor obeys." Frank absorbed it silently, wringing his cloth, sopping the wine without a word. He kept his gaze low, but his stillness carried something Marcus's friends could not name. It was not submission, though they mistook it for that. It was patience. It was restraint born of deeper places. Marcus grew restless. He wanted spectacle, not composure. He wanted the old man broken, not calm. He glanced at Jason, then at the others, hungry for their laughter. "Too easy," he muttered. "Let's raise the stakes." He strode forward, standing over Frank. "On your hands and knees," Marcus commanded. His voice rang with authority, manufactured in boardrooms and penthouses, not earned in hardship. "Crawl, like the animal you are." A hush settled, the kind that falls when cruelty sharpens into something darker. Some of the friends shifted uncomfortably, but none intervened. Their wealth had insulated them too long. They were content to watch. Frank lifted his head slightly. His face was weathered, carved with lines of age, but his eyes, clear, cold blue, met Marcus's for a moment. Something unreadable flickered there, something that made Marcus's heart lurch before pride smothered it. Then Frank lowered his gaze again and, without protest, set both hands on the marble. The room erupted with laughter. Phones appeared, cameras rolling, flashes of light, capturing humiliation they believed was real. Marcus clapped his hands together. "Marvelous," he crowed. "A janitor who knows his role at last. Crawl, old man, entertain us." Frank moved slowly, his knees steady against the cold marble. His breathing was even. He neither barked nor whimpered, though Marcus demanded it. The friends shouted encouragements laced with venom. "Make him fetch," Jason howled. "Tell him to beg." Marcus's delight swelled. He circled Frank like a ringmaster, champagne sloshing from his glass. "See how quickly a man becomes less than human when reminded of his station," he sneered. "This is leadership, gentlemen. This is power." And yet, even as Frank crawled, a strange discomfort stirred among a few of them. There was no desperation in his posture, no collapse in his bearing. It was as though he were allowing the humiliation rather than suffering it, enduring with the quiet composure of a man who had seen worse. Jason frowned, uncertain, but Marcus, drunk on his own performance, saw only what he wanted to see. "Now bark," Marcus ordered, pressing the tip of his shoe against Frank's side. "Show them what you are." But Frank did not bark. He did not even flinch. He simply paused, one knee grounded, and raised his eyes again. For a second, the penthouse felt colder. The laughter faltered, only briefly, but enough for Marcus to feel irritation creep in. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You're nothing but an animal," he hissed, "and you'll prove it." That was the moment the cruelty tipped into something irreversible, the moment the humiliation etched itself deep into the room's memory. What none of them yet realized was that the stage Marcus had built for triumph was about to become his own ruin. The marble pressed cold against Frank's knees, but his mind had already drifted far from the penthouse. The jeering voices, the demand to bark, the sting of champagne splashing down his arms, they blurred into something older, deeper. He had lived through far harsher stages than this. Cruelty from boys in tailored suits could not touch the marrow of a man who had once commanded fire in deserts and jungles alike. He remembered the heat of the Middle East, the grit of sand against his teeth, the rattle of distant gunfire that never truly stopped. As a colonel in Delta Force, Frank had led missions most of the world never knew occurred. His life had been measured in minutes of clarity, in the ability to make a decision that meant life or death for the men who followed him. He had seen villages torn apart, friends bleeding out in his arms, enemies who looked more like frightened boys than soldiers. Out there, humanity was fragile, and respect was the only true currency. Frank had grown up far from Manhattan's glass towers. The son of a steel worker in Pennsylvania, he'd learned early that dignity had nothing to do with wealth. His father's palms were rough from decades at the mill, his mother's voice soft but unyielding when she taught him to treat every neighbor with fairness. When Frank enlisted at 18, he carried that lesson with him into barracks, onto helicopters, across foreign soil. In battle, he discovered that arrogance killed more quickly than bullets. He vowed never to let pride cloud his judgment, never to let power blind him to those who carried its weight. His rise through the ranks was steady, not because he courted glory, but because others trusted him. His men called him Steady Hands, a leader who kept his head cool when chaos burned hottest. By the time he retired after nearly 3 decades, his chest bore medals that he kept hidden in drawers, reminders of battles survived rather than triumphs to flaunt. He left the service not broken, but weary. The war had taken enough. It was time to build. With his pension and savings, he started small, buying distressed properties in Pennsylvania, renovating them with his own hands, selling them to families who needed homes. What began as a side project grew when he realized he had a gift for seeing potential where others saw ruin. A condemned factory became loft apartments. A shuttered office block became a bustling hub for startups. Within 10 years, Morrison Holdings was no longer a side venture, but a rising empire. Frank's philosophy was simple: invest not in stone alone, but in people. He built communities, not just buildings. He employed veterans, men and women who needed purpose after war, giving them steady paychecks and dignity restored. He sat with architects and janitors alike, asking questions with the same respect, listening more than he spoke. Investors who doubted him learned quickly that his quiet vision yielded profit as well as loyalty. By the time Morrison Holdings acquired Sterling Tower, Frank was one of the most powerful men in American real estate. Yet he remained deliberately obscure. He preferred the shadows to headlines, letting others pose for magazine covers while he poured himself into ensuring his empire did not rot from arrogance. So when Marcus Sterling was recommended as the youthful CEO for Sterling Enterprises, a polished face from Wharton, heir to a prominent name, Frank hesitated. The board argued Marcus was perfect for attracting global investors, charismatic, well-connected, fluent in the language of wealth. Against his instincts, Frank allowed the appointment. Perhaps, he thought, youth could be tempered by responsibility. Perhaps Marcus would grow. But within months, whispers began. An assistant reduced to tears during a board meeting. A security guard dismissed for failing to salute Marcus's Lamborghini in the driveway. Parties in the penthouse that ended with caterers shoved aside and cleaners forced to scrub until dawn. Frank read the reports, listened to the quiet warnings, and remembered the promise he had made himself. Never let arrogance corrode what he had built. And so he devised the test. It wasn't the first time Frank had gone undercover. In his military years, he had donned disguises in foreign cities, learned to blend into markets and mosques, listening for the truth men spoke when they believed no one important was watching. Now he slipped into the Navy uniform of Sterling Tower's maintenance staff. His signature vanished from documents. Margaret Chen, his trusted lieutenant, covered for his absence at the top. Employees saw only a janitor moving silently through the halls, pushing a cart, wiping glass until it shone. For 8 months, he worked unnoticed. He swept offices, polished brass, nodded politely when executives brushed past him without seeing. But he also watched. He saw kindnesses, an intern who thanked him for refilling a water cooler, a secretary who offered him coffee on a rainy morning. He saw indifference, the blank stares of people too busy to acknowledge his existence. And he saw cruelty, Marcus's cruelty most of all. The young CEO strutted through corridors like a king, speaking of employees as pawns, sneering at those who could not fight back. Frank cataloged it all. Each humiliation, each careless insult, was another stone stacked on the tower Marcus built against himself. Now, on the marble of the penthouse, as Marcus demanded that he bark like an animal, Frank felt the weight of those 8 months settle into place. The experiment had yielded its result. Marcus had failed, not only as a leader, but as a man. Frank straightened slowly, his hands pressing against the cold floor. He rose not with the stiffness of an old janitor, but with the posture of a soldier long accustomed to carrying burdens. His shoulders squared, his spine stretched tall, his gaze leveled. For the first time, the mask of humility slipped, revealing the steel beneath. He looked at Marcus and thought of the oath he had taken as a young officer, to protect, to serve, to honor. Leadership was never about domination. It was about responsibility. And tonight, Marcus Sterling was about to learn that lesson in the only language he seemed to understand: exposure and consequence. The laughter in the penthouse still clung to the air, sharp and cruel, when the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Conversation faltered. Margaret Chen stepped out, her black suit tailored with the quiet precision of someone who valued discipline over display. At 50, she carried herself with the authority of 15 years at Morrison Holdings. the company's culture woven into her very posture. Her eyes landed on Frank first. He was on one knee, his jaw reddened from Marcus's slap, his cloth discarded on the marble. Then she saw Marcus standing above him, phone in hand, champagne dripping from his glass onto the floor like evidence of indulgence. The sight snapped something in her. "Marcus," she said sharply, her voice carrying over the hush. "What in God's name are you doing?" Marcus turned lazily, annoyance flashing across his face. "Discipline," he said. "Teaching the staff where they belong. Surely even you can see that." Margaret's breath caught. For months she had fielded complaints, redirected whispers, tried to shield employees from Marcus's temper. But now she saw not a rumor, not a whisper, but the cruelty itself, undeniable, recorded in champagne stains and bruised skin. And worse, she knew exactly who Marcus was humiliating. Her gaze returned to Frank, and the recognition was instant. The man kneeling on the marble was no ordinary janitor. She had sat across from him in boardrooms, traveled with him to acquisition meetings, heard his calm voice steer billion-dollar deals. She had always called him Mr. Morrison. She had known his silences, his precise way of folding his hands, the weight in his pale blue eyes. Her heart pounded. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Marcus, do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" Marcus scoffed, misreading the tremor in her voice as weakness. "Yes, a janitor who should be grateful I don't fire him on the spot." He turned back to his friends, who shifted uneasily, sensing the floor tilt beneath them. "What? Are you going to defend him now? You've grown soft, Margaret." Margaret ignored him. She stepped closer to Frank, her voice gentling in a way that made the room stir. "Mr. Morrison," she said deliberately, her words ringing like a bell in the silence, "do you want me to call security?" The title struck like a thunderclap. Marcus's friends blinked, confused. Jason Whitmore muttered, "Did she just say Morrison?" Marcus frowned, laughter faltering. "What are you talking about? His name tag says Frank. He's nothing." But Frank was already rising. Slowly, deliberately, he stood to his full height. The years seemed to fall from him as his spine straightened, his shoulders squared, and his gaze leveled at Marcus with a weight that turned the young man's smirk brittle. Gone was the hunched janitor. Before them now was someone else entirely, commanding, immovable, the gravity of the room shifting around him. "Enough," Frank said quietly. The word carried more force than Marcus's shouting ever had. His eyes swept the room, taking in Margaret, the friends, and finally, Marcus himself. "This charade has lasted long enough." In that moment, everyone in the penthouse realized the balance had shifted. The man they had mocked, filmed, and humiliated was no pawn at all. He was the hand that owned the board. The room, once alive with cruel laughter, had fallen into a silence so complete that even the hum of the city beyond the glass seemed to vanish. Frank Morrison stood tall now, no longer stooped beneath the mask of a janitor. His chest rose steady, his shoulders square, and his pale blue eyes fixed on Marcus Sterling with a calm that carried more weight than anger ever could. Marcus felt the shift like a tremor beneath his feet. The janitor's sudden transformation unsettled him in ways he couldn't name. He forced a laugh, brittle and hollow. "What is this? Some kind of performance? You think standing up straight makes you more than what you are?" Frank reached into his pocket and withdrew a slim metal card, platinum in color, its embossed letters catching the light. He held it up without flourish, as though presenting nothing more remarkable than a receipt. But Margaret Chen's eyes widened, and the men in the room gasped softly. The card read, Franklin Morrison, Chairman and CEO, Morrison Holdings. Marcus's grin faltered. He blinked once, twice, then shook his head. That's impossible. It's not, Margaret said, her voice shaking with restrained fury. Mr. Morrison owns Sterling Tower. He owns Sterling Enterprises. He owns you, Marcus. The words landed like stones. Champagne glasses slipped from hands, shattering on marble. Jason Whitmore muttered a curse under his breath, eyes darting toward the exit. Marcus stood frozen, pale now beneath the glow of the chandeliers. Frank slid the card back into his pocket and spoke evenly, his voice the calm of a man who had addressed both soldiers in the field and boardrooms of billionaires. For 8 months, I have walked these halls as a janitor. I have scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans. I did it not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see how you, Marcus, would lead when you thought no one important was watching. He let the words hang, heavy, deliberate. And I have seen enough. Marcus swallowed hard, trying to summon bravado. If I had known, that's the problem, Frank cut in sharply, his voice like steel. You only show respect when you think someone has power over you. You humiliate those you believe are beneath you. That is not leadership. That is cowardice. Employees had begun to gather just beyond the open penthouse doors, drawn by the rising tension. Phones appeared, held discreetly at waist height, recording every word. Margaret did not stop them. She wanted the world to see. Frank turned to the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command. Leadership is measured not by how you treat the powerful, but by how you treat the powerless. The cleaners, the assistants, the guards, these are the people who keep this tower alive. If you cannot respect them, you do not deserve to stand above them. A murmur of agreement rippled through the hall. The onlookers, long cowed into silence by Marcus's cruelty, straightened as if a weight had lifted from their shoulders. Marcus's face twisted. You can't just walk in here and... I can, Frank said, unflinching, because this is my building, this is my company, and you, Marcus Sterling, are finished. The young CEO's knees buckled, and he staggered back a step. His friends shrank into the background, unwilling to be associated with his downfall. Jason whispered, Jesus Christ, but offered no defense. Frank drew his phone, dialed, and spoke with crisp precision. Security, this is Morrison. Penthouse, 55th floor. Escort Marcus Sterling and his companions from the premises immediately. They are no longer welcome here. The words cut through Marcus like a blade. No, wait, he stammered. He dropped to his knees, desperation flooding his voice. Please, Mr. Morrison, I didn't know. I thought you were just a janitor. If I'd known... Frank's expression hardened. That is exactly why you are unfit to lead. Respect that is conditional is no respect at all. The elevator chimed. 3 security officers stepped out, their eyes widening when they saw Frank standing tall. Chairman Morrison, one said, snapping to attention. Your orders? Remove them, Frank said simply, gesturing to Marcus and his friends. Do it with dignity. We will not mirror their behavior. The guards moved forward. Marcus thrashed, his words tumbling into pleas. I'll change. I swear it. Don't do this. His voice cracked, high and raw, but no one moved to help him. His companions edged away, each man eager to save his own reputation. As the guard seized Marcus's arms, Frank spoke one final time, his voice calm, unyielding. Power is not license to demean. Power is responsibility to uplift. You have squandered that responsibility, and now you have nothing. The doors closed behind Marcus's struggling figure. The penthouse exhaled, the silence breaking into murmurs, then into applause that began tentatively and grew. It was not applause for cruelty defeated, but for justice revealed, for the quiet janitor who had been the true master all along. Frank did not bask in it. He only nodded once, his expression steady, and looked to Margaret. "Call the board," he said. "We will need to discuss new leadership immediately." She inclined her head. "Yes, Mr. Morrison." The penthouse, once a playground of arrogance, had become a courtroom, and its judgment had been delivered with finality. The echo of applause still lingered when Marcus Sterling was dragged into the hallway, his designer shoes skidding helplessly against the polished marble. The once impeccable CEO, who had strutted these floors like a conqueror, now looked small, his suit wrinkled, his hair damp with sweat, his eyes wide with panic. The phone he had used to record Frank's humiliation dangled loosely in his hand until a guard wrenched it away. Employees leaned out of doorways and cubicles, drawn by the commotion. They watched with quiet intensity as the man who had lorded over them for months was escorted past. Some lifted their phones, capturing the reversal. Others simply folded their arms, satisfied. No one stepped forward to defend him. The empire of fear he had built collapsed in seconds, leaving him naked before those he had despised. "Please," Marcus begged, his voice breaking. "Don't do this. I can fix it. I'll apologize. I'll change." The words tumbled out in frantic waves, but they convinced no one. They were not confessions of guilt, only the desperate scramble of a man who saw power slipping forever from his grasp. Frank had followed to the doorway, his presence steady as iron. He did not gloat, did not raise his voice. He simply watched, his silence louder than Marcus's pleas. When their eyes met, Marcus whimpered as though confronted not by a janitor or a chairman, but by the weight of his own choices. The guards pressed him into the elevator. His friends, pale and shaken, slunk in behind him, unwilling to meet the gaze of employees who now knew them as cowards and accomplices. The doors slid shut, sealing away the last of Marcus Sterling's authority. In the stillness that followed, the building seemed to exhale. A current of relief rippled through the staff, subtle at first, then spreading. People straightened in their seats. Conversations resumed with a lightness not felt in months. The toxic shadow that had haunted Sterling Tower was gone. Marcus's downfall was total, not because he lost his title, but because he left without a shred of respect. No legacy, no loyalty, no allies. His arrogance had been a fortress built on sand, and the tide had finally taken it. Frank turned back into the penthouse, his expression unchanged. Justice had been delivered, but there was still work to do. The penthouse lay quiet after the elevator doors closed, as though the very walls needed time to absorb what had just taken place. Employees lingered near the threshold, unsure whether to disperse or remain. Margaret Chen stood beside Frank, her expression a mixture of relief and awe. She had known his power in boardrooms, but witnessing him rise from a janitor's uniform into the full weight of his authority was something else entirely. A reminder that leadership, real leadership, was lived, not announced. Frank adjusted the cracked name tag on his chest, leaving it pinned as though to prove a point. He did not need to shed the disguise to command respect. The disguise had already done its work. His eyes swept the room, resting briefly on each employee who stood there, their faces alive with the realization that the man they had ignored for months had been watching them all along. "I owe you honesty," Frank said at last, his voice steady. "I chose this disguise because I needed to see how this company breathes when it thinks no one important is listening. I saw cruelty, but I also saw kindness, small acts that mattered. Those of you who showed respect to the man you believed was a janitor should know this. I noticed, and I will remember." The tension that had gripped the employees seemed to ease, shoulders lowering, breaths releasing. A young intern in the back, the same one Marcus had once humiliated, blinked back tears. Security guards stood straighter, pride flickering across their faces. For the first time in months, Sterling Tower felt like a place where dignity was possible again. Margaret cleared her throat. "What happens next, Mr. Morrison?" "For now," Frank replied, "I'll oversee Sterling Enterprises myself until we find leadership that understands respect is not negotiable. This company will be rebuilt on the values it should have never lost." He paused, his gaze lifting toward the city skyline beyond the glass. "Power without compassion is empty. From this day on, no one in this tower will be treated as less than human." Outside, the Manhattan dusk had begun to settle, streaking the horizon with orange and violet. The city roared as it always did, indifferent to triumph or downfall. But inside Sterling Tower, something had shifted. Arrogance had been cast out, and in its place rose the fragile, resilient promise of respect. Frank turned back to the room, his face calm. "Now," he said quietly, "let's get back to work." And with that, the janitor, who was also the chairman, walked into the evening, leaving behind not humiliation, but hope. A reminder that true power is not measured by how loudly you command, but by how deeply you respect.